Hello everyone. In this video I'll be expanding upon the last video about the source. So after I posted the video, I realized that the information I put forward could quite easily be interpreted as a universalist position. That being, because we all came from the same source, or all existence came from the same source, that we're all equal, or we're all the same, we're all brothers, and we're all on the same journey together. And I absolutely do not believe that. I'm not a universalist in any way, and I think I can explain that. I do believe that, for the average person, this stuff is pretty hard to understand, as they haven't thought about it that much, or they haven't gone over this stuff, whereas I think about this stuff all the time, every day, and I've gone through it for more years than I care to think of. So the universalist mindset, I guess I would most relate to something like Christianity, which is trying to get the entire world, every culture, every race, every human to believe in Jesus and the Abrahamist version of God. So to the Abrahamists, God is the grand architect, which is already getting pretty close to materialism. A lot of people accuse the Jews of being materialists, that they worship the material world and that their religion is largely just some kind of framework to justify that. But they don't really believe in the importance of anything beyond the material, and that all their efforts are put towards acquiring the material, wealth, possessions, shiny things, and cash, all that. So to them, God is a grand architect, someone who has drawn up and designed existence. And this is not really related to the Brahman concept, as I see it, which is much more based on something like dreaming or imagination than pulling out a pencil and a ruler and drawing up a design. Yes, I also received an email from one of our friends who was asking me about this exact point as well, who was questioning, am I thinking in universalist terms? And he said to me that to him, reality is more about order versus chaos, that there are these two concepts going on, or that all comes from chaos. And I think that yes, that is true, but in my way of thinking, order and chaos are below the Brahman, who is beyond duality. Duality is a fall from Brahman. Reality is not necessary to Brahman, it is only necessary to existence. Brahman is beyond duality. Duality is necessary for existence because you need black for there to be white, you need light for there to be darkness, male for female, and so on and so on. But in the mind of the Brahman, for the Brahman to exist, all these things are unnecessary. Another way of putting this would be that individuals down on earth have their own consciousness, whereas the Brahman has an omnipresent consciousness, is aware of everything at once, all the time. Also, that this universal mind or consciousness exists in the eternal. It's not subject to time like duality is. It's not subject to time like the material world and we are. The eternal never dies, and it was never born. It is just eternal. Now, it's impossible for us to understand that because as mortal beings we have no concept of the eternal. It's more like through deep thought we deduce that this must be the case, that there is an eternal, absolute truth outside of material existence, and from that sprung the material world, and what we all have to interpret as relative truth. Now, I know the postmodernists have completely destroyed this contradiction of there being two types of truth, but it must be so if there is an eternal and a material world, that there is the absolute truth that is eternal, but then there is each of our own relative truths, which is not the same thing as the absolute truth. So I guess you could say relative truth is that you're born and you're going to die, that we're all subject to gravity, night and day, all these things, but the absolute truth would be what David Icke often talks about, that all these things are actually an illusion, and the material world doesn't actually exist. It's just a figment. It's just something that our mind decodes and we believe that it exists. Also, absolute truth does not really help you in any way negotiating the material world. Knowing an absolute truth does not help you in the material world at all. It's just a deeper understanding. Really, it's relative truth that's going to help you in the material world, and understanding of the material world, how it works, and all of that. Absolute truth is more of just a deeper understanding, a deeper, more solid foundation on which to understand the material world from. So it was also said that if there is this omnipresent consciousness from which everything springs forth from, that would mean that we're all equal, right? We all worship the same God, everything's universal. Well, once again, no. I don't think there's many people out there who venerate the absolute God. Most people venerate their own version of God, whether it be Jesus, one of the thousands of pagan gods, tribal gods, even earth spirits, things like this. Most people do not worship some universal consciousness. That's not how people worship. People usually worship a humanoid form that represents either a part or all of this universal consciousness. But most people, in reality, worship a God that's very much related to themselves. Throughout the years, most people have worshipped a God that looks like them. And to take this to an extreme degree, the character of Jesus, now to everyone in the West, Jesus looks like a Westerner, but to a lot of people in Asia, they depict Jesus as an Asian. And a lot of Africans believe that Jesus was black. So just because there is a Brahman, eternal, universal mind, that does not mean that that is what everyone worships and that's what we all should be worshipping and venerating. I do not believe that at all, and I will expand on that right now. So I think one of the best ways to go about explaining very complex and hard to understand concepts such as this is to use allegory, to relate them to something that everyone already knows about, that they already essentially understand and identify with. So I'll be using Lord of the Rings to explain what I see as the concept of Brahman and existence. So if we look at the Lord of the Rings story, I'm sure everyone listening to this has at least heard of it. Probably most of you know it very well. So I would just say the Lord of the Rings, the story itself, all the characters and the world and all of that, the entire mythos, that would be existence. So the Lord of the Rings is existence. Middle Earth is the material world. Eru Iluvatar is the creator being, the benevolent God, the Yang, the light, the All-Father. In contradiction to that is chaos, represented by Sauron, the destroyer, the malevolent corrupter god, Yin, darkness, and hell in the Norse mythology. Sauron would be an agent of chaos. Maybe some people would accuse the Abrahamists of being this, or materialists and communist atheists, and yeah, you know, just agents of chaos who basically destroy, corrupt, manipulate all these things and spread darkness throughout the world. The orcs would be the foot soldiers of chaos. They represent the lower races and lower creatures. I think the wizards represent the druids and the Aryans. So the druids were like Aryan priests, and I think the wizards are clearly representative of this. I think the elves are also representatives of higher beings, noble beings, such as the Aryans. Who are benevolent, you know, yang, and they contain and harness light, whereas the agents of chaos harness corruption and darkness. They do not create, they destroy, whereas Aryans create. And this is all still going on today. We've just changed the names. I'm not going to use today's names because we're on YouTube, so I can't do that. But this is all still happening right now. And I think if you look at Saruman's nose, you'll be able to identify who he represents. So the men in Lord of the Rings are just normal people. You know, normies. If we were watching a movie, they would be extras. Just normal people, nothing special. So now that I've gone through all this, you're thinking, that's it, right? Well, so God is Eru Ilúvatar, representing order. Well, no, this is incorrect. In the Lord of the Rings, who is Brahman? Who is the creator being really? Well, the truth is that the creator being, the Brahman of Lord of the Rings, is Tolkien himself. So everything in Lord of the Rings, all the gods, all the lower gods, the wizards, everything, the entire world was created in one mind, in the mind of Tolkien. And I mean, you could say the same thing about Star Wars or any of these huge mythos universes that have been created in the mind of a writer. That this is how I think of the universal consciousness, or the Brahman. So just because the entire Lord of the Rings story all comes from the same mind, that does not mean that they're all equal and they're all friends. Much the opposite. It's a world of stark duality, of light and darkness, yin and yang, chaos and order, duality, exactly as our own world. But this entire realm, this entire existence, this entire mythos, all came from the one source, Professor Tolkien. So I hope that helps to clarify how everything can come from the same source, but it's still not universalist. We're not all friends, and hopefully you can understand that. So what we're largely talking about here would be described as idealism. That there's a universal mind and all springs forth from mind, and that matter is essentially an illusion. And, you know, in the West, people say that idealism originated with Plato. I don't know how true that is. I think idealism goes way back, but it's been attributed to Plato. So there'd be idealism versus materialism, right? Idealism being that all comes from mind, materialism being that all comes from matter. Idealism says that matter is an illusion, that it's essentially an illusion of the mind, whereas a materialist says that matter is all that exists. Now, throughout the ages, the vast majority of people have been idealists. That has been the standard throughout religion, throughout thought, philosophy, for most of the world, and I think it still is today. Although the materialists probably have one of the strongest positions they've ever had in history right now, as people have become confused and brainwashed, and they're probably not even capable of thinking much about this stuff. They just they leave it up to the priests, and they just agree with the priests. There's also the concept of idealism versus realism, which is more like Plato versus Aristotle. Plato talking about seeking perfection and all of this, whereas Aristotle is being more realistic, saying that we should accept things the way that they are. I believe that a lot of this stuff is false contradiction and false hierarchy, which is the entire point of this video series. I'm going through and explaining all the parts, so then I can challenge what I call institutionalized thinking, what Michael Tsarin has called the mysterium, which are ideas and concepts that people have just taken on board, and we've just accepted them as fact rather than really going through it. And I think this is more the result of herd mentality and sort of deifying the philosophers of the past. Like, people think of Plato as a god, not a man. They think of Socrates as God, not a man. Or same with Aristotle. These are like god men. But no, they were just men with ideas. That's what they were. And we have deified them. And I seek to challenge this institutionalized thinking, because I believe that true genius is found in contradiction, or at least what would be conceived to be contradiction to the average person. And what I mean by this is, I think the idea that you are either an idealist or a materialist, I think this is a false contradiction. And that this is the result of institutionalized thinking and deifying philosophers, and not the result of individual thinking and looking at things for yourself. So when I say that genius is found in contradiction, what do I mean by this? I think I can explain this on a few levels so that you can better understand what I'm saying. So genius is something that towers over the average person. Genius is so far beyond what a regular person is capable of that it's night and day. Comparing like Tiger Woods to someone who's just started playing golf, or just an average golf player, you know, the difference is vast. And true geniuses are quite rare, and whenever they come into the world, they are generally venerated and instantly recognized as genius. So when I talk about genius being found in contradiction, or at least what is perceived as contradiction, so the way most people think is that you are either one thing or the other, right? You're either good or bad, you're either right or wrong, you're either introverted or extroverted, you're a specialist or a generalist, you're offensive or defensive, you're a macro thinker or a micro thinker, you're a lone wolf or a team player, you're open-minded or stubborn, you're a thinker or a doer, you're academic or creative. And or there's relative truth or absolute truth. This is like the biggest philosophical argument of all time. People arguing about, one side says there's relative truth, the other side says there's absolute truth. And the genius recognizes that both of these things must exist at the same time. That almost, 95% of philosophical arguments are based on misnomers and misinterpretations and small thinking, to take one side of duality and argue that point to death. Whereas the genius mindset transcends all of this. And how I'll explain that is that genius understands that you can be both introverted and extroverted, depending on the situation. And that if you can utilize both sides of that duality, you are far superior to someone who is only capable of one side and who focuses on only one side. The other example, the specialist versus generalist. Well, there's no reason why you can't be both. And someone who is a generalist who also has a speciality is far superior to someone who just is a generalist or a specialist. Then there's offensive, defensive. I heard a great example of this would be Michael Jordan, who was, I think, you know, he's been written down as the greatest basketball player in history, but you know, I don't know much about basketball, but I know that Michael Jordan is a standout athlete, and it's been explained that he realized that most players think in terms of being an offensive or a defensive player, and he realized that you could be both, that you could master offense and defense and use both of them to completely dominate the game. And that's exactly what he did. Then the, you know, macro thinker, which is big picture, or a micro thinker, which is detail oriented. So most people think, oh, I'm going to be a manager, I'll just manage the team and I'll let the team take care of the details. Whereas the higher level thinker is capable of both. They can take in the big picture, think about the big picture, but they can also zoom right in on the most minor of details and zoom out again and relate those minor details to the big picture. Then the lone wolf or team player, well, yeah, you can be both. You can operate perfectly as an individual with no need for help from anyone else, or if you need to adapt to a team situation, you can do that as well. And open-minded versus stubborn. You can absolutely be open-minded while being absolutely stubborn. That this is not a contradiction at all to a genius. And then the thinker versus doer. I mean, we hear this one all the time, that thinkers are not doers and doers are not thinkers. Well, once again, there's absolutely no reason why you can't be a thinker and a doer and excel at both. And yeah, academic versus creative. There's absolutely no reason why you cannot excel at both. So in summary, Lord of the Rings is existence. Middle Earth is the material world. All of these things spring forth from the one source, the mind of Tolkien. And in no way does this mean that we all have to be universalists and brothers, and we all have to be the same, heading in the same direction and believing in the same things. Much the opposite. I also believe that true genius is found in contradiction, and that most of the ideas that people have about all this stuff are the result of inherited and institutionalized thinking, not individual thinking. People have set up false dichotomies, false hierarchies, and use these false dichotomies and false hierarchies to attempt to explain a world that is beyond all of it. And I think to reach a higher understanding of existence, one must look beyond institutionalized thinking and look within. What do you think about existence? What do you think about what is important? What do you think the hierarchy of existence is? What's more important, the fact that we all come from the same source, or the fact that we all live in a world of extreme duality, variation in thought and action? Are you aware that there can be different interpretations of this, that there is not just that the priest pointing his finger at you from the pulpit has no real authority, that he just made it up, and that you have just as much authority as some fucking senile parishioner. Either way, I think this video is pushing on a bit, and I think I should wrap it up. So Yes, that is the point of this video series, and we will be going through this at length to shatter the false contradiction and the false hierarchy within existence. Until next time.